Yeah, there's so many different buttons happening. As we're going along here, if you think of a conflict that you're currently experiencing, you may want to just keep that in the back of your mind to use when we go into the breakout rooms. So this is just a funny cartoon here to get us started about rock, paper, scissors. We all just get along, right? It's a fun joke, but everyone, it's a lot easier said than done. So we're going to dive into it. I really like this cartoon because it shows the importance of understanding perspective and how our cultures inform our perspective, but also the assumptions we make in our minds when just looking at someone without having that real chance to get to know people and really get down to that discussion. So this is just some food for thought to get us thinking in terms of how our culture and the way we think affects our ability to get along. So culture, this is kind of a standard definition here, the beliefs, customs, and arts and a particular society has. So how a group of people approach place, time, and a way of living, right? So how a group of people think and work together. I really like this picture going along with it because a lot of times it's easier to think of it just really the lens that we look at the world through, and depending how we identify ourselves, and as we grow and change throughout our life, our lens and our cultural approach may be different. And so it's very helpful to kind of have that analogy, that it's just a different way of looking at the world. And you might all be pretty familiar with the analogy of an iceberg, I'm sure. However, this iceberg is a good one to keep in our minds when we're looking at how do we approach people, how do we approach conflict and the cultures. What is kind of automatically popping up in our mind when we see someone? So what's observable? What kind of assumptions are we making just by seeing someone? And on the other hand, what kind of assumptions do we feel people are making about us? Or what conclusions are they drawing just by seeing us? So with our language, our behaviors, what can they just kind of tell by from the outside that they then kind of grab onto? And then under the water there, the things that are normally out of our awareness or others' awareness, things that take a lot more time to get to know. And those are things like the time orientation. So, is a culture more focused on the past versus the future? What type of values does the culture have, and how does that inform the decision making? So as those are all the things that take more time and therefore take more of a relationship to get to know. So it can cause some trouble because a lot of times the things that are observable, people make conclusions from that about the things that are under the water. So just keep the iceberg in mind. We're going to come back to that with some of the other topics. So it's a good analogy to have. With conflict, it's really helpful to think of conflict. What words come into your mind when you think of conflict? I'm curious here to maybe have anyone willing to kind of unmute and just share a few words that are popping into your mind when you hear the word conflict.
Disagreement.
Okay. What else?
Hostility.
Friction.
Difference of opinion.
Okay.
Someone in the chat said fight.
Okay, thank you. And that's a great point. If you want to go ahead and type in the chat box instead of unmuting, you can do that as well. Okay, just one or two more responses. What kind of words are popping into your head when you hear conflict?
Uncomfortable.
Okay, thank you. Brooke said clash, Christine tension, and Katie upset. And Jack said discomfort. Great. So thank you. Just this really quick poll shows that when we hear conflict, and Marvin said discourse, when we hear conflict, majority of us automatically think of something negative. So we think of that tension, the discomfort, the fighting. However, conflict itself is neutral, right? It's it just is a difference, right? Maybe there's a difference of value, a different way of thinking, a difference of how to approach resources, but in of itself, conflict is not negative. Conflict can actually be a positive thing, right? Because we can learn from the experience, we can grow from it. It's an opportunity to connect. However, because a majority of us, just based on our own experiences and how our cultures approach conflict, we tend to have a negative belief or attitude about conflict. So all those words that immediately pops into your head that you shared, that is a very common response for all the times that I've done this. It's pretty rare for someone to automatically think of something positive. Why is that important? Well, when the conflict itself happens, if we already think negatively about conflict, and then the conflict happens, we're much more likely to have a negative reaction and response. And that will then have mean that the consequence of the conflict will be negative, and that will reinforce our belief or attitude about conflict, thus keeping the cycle going. So one of the ways, as simple as it sounds, to kind of change how you are handling conflict is to think about how are you approaching it. Is there a more neutral, let alone positive way to think about conflict itself, just to kind of think how to change your mindset going into it?
Mile, I'm sorry. Can you just repeat that just so that I'm clear? You're saying that the piece about conflict and negative and how we approach it because we see it as negative. Can you just repeat that just so I'm clear on what you're saying there, please?
Sure, thanks, Kaiser. So if we are going into a conflictual situation with a negative attitude about conflict, where we're kind of expecting frustration, expecting a fight, expecting to have to put up our defenses and really get into it, we're much more likely to have a negative reaction or response to the conflict when it does happen. So, and because of that attitude or outlook of the conflict, there will be negative consequences. So the actual conflict itself, that interaction, is less likely to go well because we're approaching it in a much more defensive way where we're already expecting it not to go well. And so when it doesn't go well, that reinforces that belief and attitude, and then keeping the cycle going. So if we think to ourselves, if we kind of just tweak our approach to conflict and see it as something neutral, that it's just a conflict, and it's what we are adding to it, our thoughts and feelings about conflict, that are making it harder to approach and harder to make it productive. I see a couple of heads nodding. Any thoughts or questions about that? And so kind of along that same line of thinking, that when we are approaching a conversation, not necessarily even a conflict, just a regular conversation, a lot of how that conversation goes depends on our mindset going into it. So when we're listening, our mind can wander so many different places, and it is really important to be aware of our own blocks to listening. And by that, I mean, the internal noise we have going on while other people are speaking. And as I'm going through these, I want to just, if you have something to make a note with, just make a note of a few that you identify with. Maybe there are some that you might identify more with in the work setting versus in a personal setting versus with specific people. So there might be some of these you're more likely to do with certain colleagues than you are with certain alumni that you're interacting with, for example. And so we're going, as I'm reading through these, just to make a little notes, because I'm going to go into the breakout rooms. We want to be able to discuss what your blocks were, if you were aware of them or not already, and then kind of how you handle them. So just to go through these briefly, the first block to listening is comparing. So I think this is a really common one. This is when we're listening, but as soon as we hear what the speaker is saying, we're immediately comparing it to our own experience, our own story. Mind reading, we are, as a listener, if you're hearing someone talk and you're mind reading in your mind, instead of fully listening to what they're saying, you're already trying to guess ahead at what they're going to say next. Rehearsing is just like it sounds. Instead of giving them your full attention, you're already in your mind internally practicing what you will say as soon as they're done talking. So you have your response geared up and ready to go, even if that doesn't mean you're not hearing the last bit of what they said. Judging is another really common one where as they're speaking, you are kind of labeling their character or what they're saying. So where you're like, oh, in your mind, you're like, oh, that's a dumb idea. Or how can a person be so silly to think that? Where you're already kind of coming to conclusions when the person isn't even done speaking yet. Now, I just want to note as I'm describing them, they may sound like they all are negative, but they do have, a lot of them do have good intentions behind them. So for example, this next one, advising, people want to be helpful, right? So we want, if we hear somebody asking questions or having challenges, we want to help them. And so a lot of times coming into it, in our minds, as they're explaining their situation, you might already be thinking of advice of, oh, well, if they just did this, or, oh, I need to tell them to go check out this resource. Of course, so that has a good intention, but because you're already so quick to help, you're not fully present and listening to everything that they're saying, all the details and tone. Filtering, that is kind of where the really related to emotional safety. So instead of being fully present, you're listening just enough to make sure that you're emotionally safe. So as long as you can tell they're not upset at you, then you kind of just will kind of nod and keep the conversation going. That's a lot of, okay, yep, sounds good. So make sure they can tell you're listening, but you're only listening as much as you need to be okay. Being right is, though I'm sure we can all think of at least one person who does this, where they are thinking how to kind of take whatever you're saying and maybe tweak it a little bit, or think how they can use what you're saying, what the speaker is saying, to prove that they're right. So to know that, to show that they already understand, or they know what to say or do next. Now, the dreaming is, I think, the only block to listening that's kind of widely known. We kind of have this image of people just going off on a daydream, thinking about being at the beach in their hammock and really thinking about that. And so it's really any time that your mind is somewhere else other than the conversation. Maybe you're bored, maybe you don't care, and maybe it's just more fun, but it's where your mind is elsewhere. Derailing, that is where the conversation, the speaker is, maybe they're talking about a topic that you don't like. Maybe it's something you're not interested in. Maybe it's a topic that doesn't have anything to do with the purpose of your conversation. And so as a listener, you're thinking how to get the conversation on a different track, how to change the topic, or just really get them to stop talking. So really, yeah, so that is one you can kind of think of too. For a lot of these, it might be easier to think of other people who do them, but there'll be some for sure that you can, I tell that you can have done before. The identifying is very similar to comparing. However, in identifying, again, you could still have a good intention. You want to show that you're listening, that you can relate to their experience, that you really identify with what they're saying. So very similar to comparing, but with comparing, it's more like one-upping them. That's where you say, oh, well, your story, you want to hear a good story about an event. I'll wait till you hear my story. So that's the difference there. Placating is where you're saying enough just to keep the person talking. You're keeping them happy. So that's where you go, okay, yeah, just you're showing that you're listening enough to keep them talking. And the last one there is sparring. So that is when a listener is kind of wanting to do a verbal debate or wanting to pick out key things that they can come back with instead of fully listening. I know I went through those fairly quickly. I want to just pause for a second and to see if you have any questions, if you need any clarification on any of those blocks.
Can you please repeat the filtering one, please?
Okay, sure. Yeah, so filtering is where you're making sure that that you're emotionally safe. It's really um, kind of half listening, where you're just wanting to make sure that you can take in the key parts and that you don't really need to listen to the full thing.
Thank you.
And something else to think about is, how much of these, so as you're thinking about when do you tend to do these, are they with specific types of people, certain times, certain individuals, and kind of see if there's any patterns. Now, often when this idea of a block to listening is presented, people will say, okay, I get it. I have a block to listening. Now what? And I think the thing there to remember, again, is that nobody's perfect, right? Somebody will do this even if we have good intentions. So the idea is once we have the awareness that this is happening, is to think, how can we kind of catch ourselves? It can be as simple as saying, hey, my mind wandered. Would you mind repeating what you just said? Often people get almost embarrassed to admit that they were having a block to listening, and then they kind of just keep the conversation going. However, as you might have experienced before, if you've ever done that, that you might miss key information and not even know it because you don't go back to clarify or confirm. And so simply could say, hey, my mind wandered, would you please repeat? Other ways to handle these blocks would be things like doodling or taking notes, or other ways to kind of keep your focus and attention as you're listening to the conversation.
Milo, curious question here. And is there any, I guess the question I'll ask is, how might culture or maybe our own identity influence how much we use these behaviors, or maybe even how we interpret them when we see them in others? Just a curious question there. If there's anything you might want to share, if there's anything that you can share on that.
That's a great point to bring up because, depending on what culture you're from, there might be different expectations for how involved the listener should be. So I think that is something just to be aware of, that not everyone sees it the same. So kind of akin to eye contact, right? A lot of times we think everyone wants eye contact, and that's not necessarily true. So there may be some cultures that could see, depending on how you are oriented with time, you might see it appropriate to rehearse so you're not taking that time, that you're quick to answer and keep going. And so that is something where you'd want to make sure that you're understanding, is it really a cultural thing? Is it an individual person? Trying to decipher what exactly is causing or motivating the person to respond that way. And I don't know, Kaiser, if that really answered your question or if you want to add some more to that.
Oh, no, nothing. No, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that definitely got to the gist of what I was getting at. Yeah, thank you.
And yes, thank you. Luke also mentioned not to forget about the neurodiverse population when it comes to eye contact, and many don't prefer it. That is true. So just like any of the times, you don't want to do a blanket statement, right? There's always those exceptions. And so just to keep that in mind as you go through these, I think the main purpose of the blocks to listening is to really have that self-awareness. To know, are you truly listening? And then also can be able to tell, are others really listening? Are they really getting it? Or is their mind on their shopping list or their story, that type of thing. And the reason this is really important is because we all have these blocks. And if we're not aware of them, then we can't really get down to the real issue. We can't really fully hear each other and be able to keep the conversation in a productive direction and really understand each other as we're working through a conflict.
So I have a question, because
Okay.
you answered it in one way, but then you made me think of another question. Isn't it possible that, because you have 12 listed, that as a conversation goes through, you may go from one to a different, to multiple different ones through a course of a conversation? Because I don't know, and I'm just hypothesizing here, I find it very hard to believe that anybody doesn't, I mean, there's not an individual that doesn't go through any of these at any given point. Like we all have some type of, you know, multitasking mind, for lack of a better term.
Yes, great point, Michael. It's very true. Especially, I'm sure there are people who would say as time has moved on, our attention spans have gotten shorter, we're more pressured with time, more demands on our time and energy. So that, yes, I am sure in a conversation, you're most likely to have multiple of these and to kind of jump from one to the other. And so very true. And I think that's why it's so important we can catch ourselves, because before other people really notice, because it's harder for other people to catch us, or harder for us to want to listen to when other people say they've caught us. But really good point. We can definitely go back and forth.
Can I ask or add something to that?
Yeah.
Isn't it possible too that your blocks can be specific to the people or the group that you're talking to?
Yes, really good point. And I think this is also where this can be thought of in addition, like you're saying, in terms of bias. So if you might have an unconscious bias for a specific, age of student or age of alumni, or someone in a specific career, and if you automatically know you're speaking to a person from that group, you might just start mind reading, right? You're going to say, oh, I know what they're going to say next. I've heard this before. It's just another person who's fill in the blank. So really good point, Nicole. And again, really highlighting again why it's even more important when it comes to culture and these DEI conversations, to be able to understand how these blocks happen. So the next main point I want to go into is the positions versus interests. And you can see the iceberg again here, because the positions versus interests is really crucial to be able to identify what they are so that you can move through the conflict. So positions are what people want. It is what they say they want, and it is kind of the obvious on the surface. It's the thing that's their stance, if you will. So uh, people can say it pretty quickly and easily and concisely. I want a higher salary. I do want to have this alumni reunion event. I think this costs too much money and I do not think it's worth it. Whatever it is, people are normally pretty upfront about their position. And a lot of times we can make a pretty good guess of what the position is by their words and their behavior. However, what is under the water there is the interest. So the interest is why someone wants what they're saying their position is. And often it's not as obvious as you think it would be, right? And this is where we get in trouble, because this is where we make those assumptions of what somebody else's interest is, typically based on what our own interest would be in that situation. Now, I know, and I'm probably showing my age here when I bring up the video game Atari, but when I think of Pong, if you get this analogy, you kind of think of, the ball bouncing back and forth, right? And that's one of the ways I think of positions versus interests. If you just stick with whatever this person's position is and whatever this person's position is, it just kind of boinks back and forth, right? You don't really make much progress. It's just people fight. I want this. I want this. However, if you're able to get down to a party's interests, that's where you make progress, because that's when that little ping pong ball starts going in different directions and being able to move ahead. So we really need to be able to first know what our positions and interests are, but then be able to think, what could somebody else's positions and interests be? So we want to think, what steps can we take? How our real goal is thinking, how can we move this conversation to being focused on the positions, the obvious things people are saying what they want, to go further down, kind of peeling down that onion, so to speak, and get to those interests, get to what are those motivations. So as a kind of cheat sheet, if you will, for this, a lot of times those underlying interests our basic universal human needs. So it is typically things like respect, fairness, communication, transparency, those things that a lot of times people aren't quick to associate with what they're saying they want or that position. But when it comes down to it, that's really why, that's really the heart of the matter. And so again, with that ping pong ball, until you get to the heart of the matter, you're not going to make progress. And so it's really almost like an investigation, right? You know, how can I be aware of and share my interests in a way that can be heard and understood? But how can I help the other person I'm speaking with or the other people I'm speaking with be able to figure out, get to, and communicate their interests? So I want to just pause for a second to make sure that's clear, because when we go into our breakout rooms, we're going to be thinking of an example and then trying to identify what are the positions and interests within that example. So let's just pause here for a second and see what would an issue be. Let's just brainstorm for a second, a couple of issues, so that when we do get ready to apply it, we know what we're talking about. So I'm wondering if anything is, as we're discussing this, if is anything popping into anyone's mind of something where you're thinking, if I can figure out this person or this group's issues, that would be a really helpful way to move forward in the conversation. And while you're thinking on that, just want to read here, Tricia said, what happens when personality styles make it challenging to bring a person to the level of position? Trish, would you mind, if you're able, would you mind elaborating on that?
Sure, thanks. So like one example, you know, like for example, if you look at like DISC personality styles, right? Like some people are more like the dominant style, right? And some people are more like, have more of a relationship and collaborative style, right? So if you have someone who's like very dominant and doesn't want to go into like the details of things, it just is the way it is. And you're someone who's like more collaborative and really wants to get to that position level so that you can move ahead like more amicably or like, you know, more effectively. You know, I think that because I totally understand what you're saying. And I do believe like we have to be at that, you know, or more at that level of understanding what people want to get to. But how do you do you have any suggestions or recommendations for how you can sort of bridge that personality or approach gap in order to get there when somebody might not really be interested in that?
That's a great question. Because you're right, depending on how we're approaching the conflict, how our style is, will affect how much we are aware of and willing to open up and share what our positions and interests are. So like you're saying, if somebody is really really combative and very aggressive, they are very assertive, they may have more of a tendency to just share their position and really dig their claws into that, and may not be as open as you're saying, someone who's very collaborative and really wants to get down into everyone's interests, figure out solutions that work for all. And so I think to kind of navigate that difference is really understanding, as much as you can, knowing the personalities or those values of the people coming into it. And so, or meant to get to them. Okay. So that if you kind of already have an awareness of the personalities that you're working with, that will be helpful in knowing how to word the questions, or knowing that if a person may need some more time to think and get back to you before they are willing to be vulnerable and open up in the interests. And so I think it's really just a matter of knowing as much as you can about the person or people and their values. What are their goals in the conversation or conflict? And then depending on kind of your level of relationship, how much can you really push there? So how many questions, how can you work through kind of slowly hearing them out? So I think that really is actually a good segue into the next point here, which is, what are some strategies for moving from positions to interest? And so just to go over a few of these, and then if I didn't quite answer your question, Trish, we'll come back to it. But I think if you're wanting to move to interests, you first need to know, well, what are your interests? What are your values, your needs, your goals? Um, it may sound really obvious, but a lot of times when we really get into a conflict, it isn't necessarily easy to stop and pause the feelings we're having, right? Because a lot of times conflict in these conversations can feel um, very intense, very time sensitive. And so just taking that breath, the power in that pause of saying, okay, hold on. What are my values, needs, and goals in this? What am I working towards? Um, if how what is the importance of this for me, and how much am I wanting to express and share? So having that, and then brainstorming that for the other person or side. So it helps a lot if you know them, you know their values or personality. But even if you don't, you can get into some good guesses there. So kind of writing that down, having these thoughts on paper. And then you want to think, okay, if people, especially if you know their personality to be more combative, or if you don't know people that well and you're still filling them out, or if it's just something that feels really stuck or very tense, really want to keep in mind and stress keeping the energy as calm and non-defensive as possible. So really thinking through that. So how am I going to express myself in a way that others are able to hear it? So one way to do that is expressing thoughts with I messages. Again, when you use I, the focus is on you and your interpretation, and it avoids placing blame. The second people hear the word you, it's like those little transformer toys, right? The ears close, the punching hands come up, and they're no longer really listening. And we can't move to interest if people aren't listening. The next one there is listening for facts, feelings, common as hidden offers. So that's a lot of stuff. Let me just quickly explain what that means. So listening for facts and feelings, a lot of times it can be hard to decipher between the two. So what really is a fact versus someone just feeling very strongly about it. So trying to peel through that. But a lot of times people will say, even if they're not realizing it, they'll say things that they have in common. Or maybe they'll say something and they may not realize that you feel that way too. So whenever there's those commonalities, that's a really good way to build rapport, show some progress with the conversation or conflict, but also showing those kind of like the human sides of how can you come with a solution that will work for everyone, and to show that you do have some of those same interests, some of those same needs. And listening for the hidden offers. So sometimes just in kind of those brainstorming type sessions, people will just kind of say something that may work for them. So just kind of off their head, they may say, oh, well, if they would just say sorry, I'd be able to move on. Or, hey, if we just agreed on this one part of the plan, then I think we can go through with the event. And a lot of times that can be lost in the conversation. So really trying to listen to that and follow up with that. Say, up, kind of like catching that and focusing on that. And then finally, having the ability, and this is again with being non-defensive, and kind of checking in as you're making that progress forward. How can you clarify and confirm that you're understanding them accurately? And also, of course, you want to be understood accurately as well. And so how to do that as you're moving along is by paraphrasing or saying back the facts and feelings that you're hearing, and using open-ended questions. So those open-ended questions are those questions that need more than a word or two to answer, and basically are questions that start with question words besides the word why. So just like the word you, the word why automatically puts people on the defense. When people are on the defense, that's when they kind of dig into those positions, and they're not yet at a place where they feel comfortable enough to share the interest. A lot of times people kind of approach positions as interest almost like cards that you're playing, right? If people don't feel comfortable putting down the card of their actual interest, what they really want, then you're not going to get there. So really trying to think, how can I make sure I'm understanding this before I get too far ahead? And the best way to understand someone else is by asking those open-ended questions. Because with open-ended questions, that's how people will keep talking. And that's how they'll give more detail, more feelings. And it's also how you, when you're asking the questions, you'll be able to help their thought process move from past, present, and future. Those questions help people get unstuck in their position because they're really thinking through the consequences, kind of reality testing where they're at with it. So those open-ended questions are really key to help kind of develop the thinking as you're moving along. I want to pause there because that's a lot of information, and I want to see if there's any comments or questions. Okay, well, just a few more things about those helpful questions because they are so important. Really want to be aware of using neutral language or tone. What I mean by saying it may take laundering is, when you think of laundering, you think of like cleaning clothes. and when we're laundering language, we're laundering it to take out the toxicity. So taking out anything that's really triggering, taking out that kind of the wording that makes it feel either or, makes people feel boxed in. And it's when we're laundering language, we're also looking at how do we keep throughout this whole time, we really want to keep the main points of what's said, but present it in a way that's more productive. So can we, if you're laundering it, to make the focus more appropriate? Sometimes people will say statements that are way too vague or way too specific. And when you launder it, you help get a focus that is really meaningful and moving forward with the interest. So for some examples of how to ask questions that will keep this moving along are, what are you most concerned about? And so this is a way to help people kind of rank their concerns or really get down to what they value. And to the what question also helps people get unstuck because they're not thinking just one concern. They're thinking, what are you most concerned about? So they have to think about all their concerns and then really prioritize or highlight what they really need to get done. Like that kind of the concern that if that's not met, the other concerns won't come out and be discussed. Things like how would you want to have that handled if it happens again? That's a really good way of reality testing. If people will just say, oh, next time we'll just do this. Well, is that really how you would want it handled? And then really defining those key values, that these words that people tend to be fast at throwing out without realizing that people may have different definitions of them. So something like, what does fairness in a project look like to you, is a really helpful way to get people to elaborate and to get people to really define what fairness means for them. Because just like a lot of our other culturally sensitive values, fairness may look and probably does look very different depending on the situation and the person who's talking about it. And that could be any of the other interests as well. So whether that underlying interest is respect or trust or communication, really having people actually open up and detail and explain it. Because we may assume in our mind what fairness is and just think everybody else thinks the same thing. But people have come to it with different definitions or different expectations. And depending on kind of the seriousness or the amount of time you have to prepare for the conversation, it could actually be helpful to make a little chart just to kind of get those thoughts and feelings out. Really thinking, well, what is observable, about the position or about that person that you know? And then what do you not know? What are you making guesses on? It's also helpful to kind of switch that perspective and try to even think, what would other people be assuming or guessing about you and your positions and interests? That can be a really helpful way to kind of check that. And also, even when when other people are talking about it, to trying to check in and even have them summarize. So all of that said, I think when I pause again here to give time for any questions or comments, and then we'll move into our breakout rooms. So any questions or comments about all that information before we go any further?